I'm Ed Feinstein. I'm one of the rabbis here at Valley Beth Shalom, and it's a privilege to welcome you on behalf of our partners, Stephen Weiss Temple, Leo Beck Temple, Temple Ramat Zion, the Jewish Journal, and the Jewish Federation, for an evening of learning, conversation, and reflection at a very critical moment in the history of our community. We are communities devoted to conversation, debate, learning, reflection, and a deep commitment to the Jewish people, to the State of Israel, and to American democracy. And the best traditions of Torah and of American democracy call upon us to learn, to reflect, to debate in an atmosphere of mutual respect, in an atmosphere of reflection and learning, with the humility to know that not one of us, no matter how sure we are about our opinion, knows everything there is to know. And we come together to learn and to grow together. This community, Valley Beth Shalom, has a long history of dealing with very difficult issues in an environment of mutual respect, listening, learning, debating. Tonight, you're going to hear opinions that conform with your own opinion, and you'll shake your head and say, see, I knew I was right. Tonight, you're going to hear opinions that are exactly the opposite of your opinions, and you're going to say, who is he? But you're going to do that in an atmosphere of respect. To hear opinions that you didn't come with is what we call education. To confront ideas you hadn't thought about, facts you didn't know about, realities you might not be aware of, is how you open your mind and deepen your heart. I'm going to ask you to listen carefully. You may at the end agree with our speaker, you may disagree with our speaker, but you will do it in an environment of respect. Simple respect for one another. Now, because this issue is so emotional, rather than have people stand up and ask questions, if you would like to ask the speaker a question, we're going to have a way to do that. You're going to raise your hand during the talk, and Alana and Louise, who are standing in the back, will bring you a piece of paper and a pen. You will write your question in English, in legible handwriting, on that piece of paper with the pen. And they will collect them, and I'll go through them, and we'll pick a few of them to ask our speaker. If you write a novel, I will take it home with me and read it before I go to bed, but I won't ask you that question. The shorter the question, the more likely it is I'm going to ask the speaker that question. If it begins with the words what, where, when, why, and how, and ends with a question mark, it's more likely the question will be asked than, don't you know that? And that won't get asked. I want to also invite you, as in the course of our conversation, to return Shabbat morning, Saturday morning. Well, I'm a rabbi, and I'm always asking you to come Shabbos morning. But this Shabbos morning in particular, in addition to praying together, we'll be welcoming our Congressman Brad Sherman, who is going to continue our conversation about these very important issues and discuss how he's going to vote on these issues in Congress during September. You're welcome to come. Services begin at 9:30. The congressman will be speaking somewhere around 11 o'clock. There'll be lunch served afterwards, and you can converse with the congressman over tuna salad and tell him why you think he's right or wrong. It is a pleasure to have all of you here. Our speaker tonight is the leading authority on the United States foreign policy in the Middle East. Professor Steve Spiegel has taught at UCLA for now 40 years and is recognized around the country for the clarity of his thinking, the depth of his understanding, his grasp of the complexities of Middle East politics and the United States' place in world diplomacy. He's the author of more than 100 academic articles and the standard textbook in the area of Middle East diplomacy. He's a good friend of our community, a good friend of all of us together, and it's a deep honor to have him with us to help us through these issues. Please welcome our speaker, Professor Stephen Spiegel.
Thank you, Rabbi Feinstein. I wish that was recorded. I could play it for some of my colleagues. But at any rate, it's very good to be here tonight. I don't kid myself. Many of you might be at the Dodger game or the Hollywood Bowl tonight if I were talking about another topic. And I must say that over the course of the summer, I personally, and so many others, have had so many sleepless nights worrying about the situation that is called the Iran deal. And there are so many issues that I will try to deal with tonight. I hope you don't mind being here till midnight. Issues of the impact of this debate on the American Jewish community, on U.S.-Israeli relations, on Israeli-American Jewish relations, on the future foreign policy and image of the United States, and on Iran itself, of course, which we rarely talk about. So I'm going to try to skip over many of these issues, say something about them, and then we'll try to put it all together with my own perspective at the very end, and of course be happy to answer any kinds of questions. Wherever people go, this is the issue. A friend of mine at UCLA was telling me about his wife who was in a book club, and this Monday night, 3 nights ago, she went to a monthly book club meeting, and over dinner, huge fight about, guess what? The Iran deal. Wherever we go, wherever we look, today, ADL came out against the deal. The federations come out against the deal. Lots of people are coming out for the deal. I don't remember a case where this American Jewish community was so divided. And it's very disturbing because no matter who wins between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, oddly enough, at least in the first vote, before it will be the last vote if both houses do not vote to reject the deal, which means voting for the resolution is too complicated to get in because it doesn't really matter much. But if the Iran deal is rejected, the president will veto, and then perhaps by the end of Sukkot, we'll know whether Congress will override the veto or not. The betting in Washington is that the president will win, but I'm not sure I'd put a lot of money on that, but that's what people feel and think. So much work has been done by so many since the dawn of Israel's existence, and it has created the U.S.-Israeli relationship we know, or at least knew, today. The period of burden when most presidents, particularly Eisenhower, when most foreign policy officials, particularly in the State Department, believed that Israel was a burden. They were, as Eisenhower said once to Philip Klutznick, the great Jewish leader of the 50s, one of the great Jewish leaders of the 50s, when he's head of B'nai B'rith and very active, and when he said to him, Phil, I don't know that I would have gone along the way Harry Truman did. And that was the general rule. Israel was a burden. Then came the Six-Day War. And then we entered a period which I would delineate is until 1992, where presidents were ambivalent. Nixon, who was ambivalent about everything, but when Golda Meir came in and said, Mr. President, the Jewish people know you've always been a friend, he'd love it. The fact that it had a lot of problems with facts didn't seem to matter. But the latest documents that came out show that Nixon and Kissinger were often lying to the Israelis. And then you had Ford, who couldn't stand Rabin, and Carter, who couldn't stand who couldn't stand Begin, and Ronald Reagan, who came in, who wanted to declare Israel as a strategic asset, and which he did in an article in the Washington Post in August of 1979. And yet, Ronald Reagan said, this guy Begin, he really makes it tough on you. Hard to like that guy Begin. And then came Shamir, Yitzhak Shamir, as prime minister, and Reagan and his Secretary of State Schultz could certainly get along with him. These things didn't happen by accident. Lots of work. And then came H.W. Bush, who couldn't stand Shamir, to the point where loads of conflicts, whether it was loan guarantees or arguments about settlements. There's a famous story when both of them met in the White House for the first time, and when the prime minister comes to see the president, there is a small period when they're alone. It depends on the prime minister and the president. And H.W. Bush said to Shamir, he said, we got a little problem on settlements. And Shamir said, Mr. President, no problem on settlements. And Bush thought he meant no problem, because if we make progress in the peace process, that settlements will not be a problem. And Shamir meant no problem, because I'm going to stay just where I am. I'm going to keep growing those settlements. So they had a lot of. In came Bill Clinton and began a new a new era. I feel your pain writ large. Sympathetic. Values identified. Doing all he could for Israel. Couldn't stand Netanyahu, by the way. But with Rabin, we all know, Shalom Chaver, Barak, the third prime minister he dealt with, he wouldn't let anyone like Dennis Ross really deal with Barak. He wanted to deal with Barak himself because he could work with him, as he felt he couldn't with Netanyahu. Israel was great. And then came W. Bush. Some of you are Democrats, some of you are Republicans. W. Bush loved the Israelis. He loved the Israelis. You might disagree with his policies. You'll see that I did at times myself, but loved Israel. And in comes the most complex of them all, Barack Obama. I don't know where we are historically, but Barack Obama, believe it or not, he has trouble with that, feeling your pain, I love you. He has trouble with identifying the values. But when it comes to military security, he has the best record of all presidents. That's a fact. And the problem is we're getting so much information, we don't always understand that. But he cannot stand the Israeli prime minister. I think we can all agree on that. So where are we going with this U.S.-Israeli relationship? Concern number one. And it's a big concern for those of us who've been working on this for so many years. It's a great worry, because if the Jewish people are divided, it's not good for American Jews, and it's not good for Israel. And suddenly, the Prime Minister of Israel is a Republican. Most American Jews are not. What is he trying to do? What does he aim by this campaign? We'll get back to that. So, the first set of nightmares is about the Jewish community and the American-Israeli relationship. Let's deal with a couple of myths and notions that appeal to one side or the other. First of all, that the Iranians want to destroy Israel. That's true. Now, if you deal with the intellectual class, as I have, if you meet individual Iranians, they're horrified by their country's position. And some of them are in very prominent positions, so they don't talk very much. Except if you take a walk, there's the famous, I call it walk in the sand, because so many Soviet American deals were made on walks. Here there are, if you take a walk with Iranians and you break them down, with the liberal elite, it's a very different position. Don't forget that America is more popular in Iran among the masses than any other country in the region. And the way Israel's going, I'm not so sure Israel would be ahead of them. Ehud Yari, the distinguished Israeli newscaster who specializes in the Arab world on Channel 2, his personal good friend, very active in the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Ehud Yari has an article out in the American Interest this week entitled, something to the effect, how Iran wants to destroy Israel. And it's not a nuclear plan. As the Palestinians, the head of Hamas said the other day, we don't want Iran to attack Israel. We'd all be killed too. Think about it. If you have a nuclear weapon, it's a very tiny country. So the plan is, and he does, I think, an incredible job proving his point, that what the Iranians are trying to do is wear Israel down. Wear Israel down in 4 places on its border. They want, of course, Lebanon, Hezbollah, which they've supported since its inception in 1982, but they're also looking at the Golan, quiet for so many years. They disagree with Assad on this point. There have been incidents on the Golan. That's their second line of attack. Hamas, with which they're having some trouble right now, but in the south, go after it, and in the West Bank. They're really working on building up the opposition and the violent opposition to Israel in the West Bank. So that's the plan, a kind of pincer movement around Israel's borders that doesn't have, Iran provides the arms. The Palestinians do the dying in this plan, and the Syrians. And he makes a very good case that that is the real plan. It's different from a Holocaust myth. It doesn't mean that Iran is not dangerous for Israel, but it's a different kind of danger. And then there's the myth, and I think it's a myth, that if this deal is accepted, all will be well. I have a friend in Boston, a Jewish leader, who coaxed me into, who is a real super liberal, and he was asked to write, along with many others, when the deal was signed, a note of what he thinks is going to happen. And I said, well, what do you want in this article? I was kind of resentful of having to do it. He said, well, I want to say that we're going to have peace between Iran and Israel, peace in the Middle East, a new Middle East as a result of this article. I said, that's what you want to say? So he wrote it. So I wrote it, and he was very excited about it. And he said, well, would you sign it with me? I said, X, I don't agree with the article. Because this is not peace in our time. There are several theories among people who favor the agreement, who think that the kinds of people that academics like me get to talk to will emerge if Iran becomes a more vibrant, economically effective society, which it isn't today, that what people really want is a situation in which they can live normal lives without the sanctions, which have deeply hurt the Iranian economy. They don't care about nuclear weapons. They want the good life. They want to be like Americans. And we know that. They're not running the country, but we know that, even though it's a more moderate presidency. So I don't think the Holocaust myth works the way many are presenting it, and I don't think the peace in our time, great lives works either. Let's spend a few minutes on the history of Iranian-American and Iranian-Israeli relations, because nobody ever talks about the subject. Nobody ever talks about the subject. And it's much more complex, I think, than people realize. Now, if this were a course, we'd probably spend 4 or 5 hours on what I'm about to spend 10 minutes on. But nevertheless, we're mentioning it. The United States has had a very checkered history with Iran, even before the Ayatollahs came along. We've never really succeeded with Iran for complex reasons. Even in World War I, when the country was split between Russian occupation in the north and British occupation in the south, and American soldiers didn't do very well in Iran. They weren't very popular. And it was true that the occupation occurred because the Allies didn't trust the Iranians or the influence of the Germans. They overthrew the Shah, put in his son, the Shah we now think as the Shah. And after World War II, we ended up strengthening the Shah and making his career. Now, it worked great for a while, 30 years really. But when the Shah got into serious trouble and was challenged by Mossadegh, Truman tried to make peace because Mossadegh was challenging the British, who had the oil and were cheating the Iranians, which they were, by the way. Truman failed because Mossadegh was so difficult to deal with, and in came Eisenhower. He didn't have any patience for this kind of thing, and when Kermit Roosevelt, who was a nephew of the famous Roosevelts and who came in and said, let's just get rid of Mossadegh, Eisenhower was thrilled. So they got rid of Mossadegh and brought back the Shah, and the Shah ruled in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And in that period, the Shah became more and more of a tyrant. He had his intelligence people who were killing opponents and torturing them. That was the Savak. And because we identified with the Shah, the people saw us more and more as the enemy. In early 1961, President Kennedy had a new policy. He had a new approach. He had a new vision. And it was reform everywhere. And he got the Shah to engage in agricultural land reform. Well, land reform meant that the clerics, the imams, they would have to give up their land, much of it. And there emerged a man by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini who was opposed. And he became a great hero. And he was exiled by the Shah. And by the 70s, his image was growing more and more. But by the 70s, the Shah was basically screwing the United States, raising oil prices. And as he raised oil prices, Nixon and Kissinger came up with this idea, oh, great. He thinks he's going to get money from us. We'll just sell him arms. So he'll screw us with the oil, and we'll screw him by selling him expensive arms. And that worked well for a couple of years, but then it completely exploded. The Iranian economy. And the revolution began. I remember I was in complex how I got there, but I got there because the Israelis who were very close to the Iranians. They wanted me to go there. I was speaking. I got a call, would I come and speak at Tel Aviv University? I said, sure. And next thing I knew, I was being shipped off to Iran after my speech. And they were nonstop flights on El Al from Tel Aviv to Tehran. Quite exciting. And the Israeli, it didn't really ambassador, but the legation head, it was really the ambassador. He saw the Shah almost every day. He said to me, you better take a message back that the Shah is not going to last a year. I took the message back and nobody would listen. We knew the Shah, the Savak, was telling us that everything was fine. But the Bazaris and the clerics and the intellectuals and the peasants were all building up. And it exploded, as we all know. The Shah was overthrown. He was very sick. He soon died of cancer. But the problem was that Ayatollah Khomeini emerged as the great figure. And the Ayatollah Khomeini wanted to get rid of the American relationship, and he wanted to get rid of the Israeli relationship. He saw both and he tested both. So what's the result? We entered into this horrific relationship with the Iranians. There was the hostage crisis. The Iraqis, under Saddam Hussein, said, well, here's a new regime talking about overthrowing nearby regimes. I'm the closest to them. They're going to want to overthrow me. I don't go for this Islam. But in the south, where the oil is, there are Arab-speaking Iranians. I'll just go in there and take some land because they're so weak. And then you had the 8-year Iran-Iraq war. And he might have done it if Iraq was not so weak. He might have done it if Iraq was not so weak and messed up the situation. And finally, even though Iraq won the war, not before Israeli-Iranian relations had deteriorated further, and we'd had the famous Iran-Contra deal that almost led to Reagan's impeachment, which I'm not going to go in now, but it embarrassed the United States. And by the time the war was over and H.W. Bush was president, he didn't want any part of Iran. He didn't want to do anything with Iran because people might question him and Iran-Contra. By now, the Ayatollah had finally died. And who was going to replace the Ayatollah? The Ayatollah had this Platonic idea. Plato had this idea of the great figure who would rule a country. So the Ayatollah saw himself as very odd for an Islamic figure as the new Plato leader. But now he was dead. Who was going to replace him? So in the maneuvering, the fellow who won almost accidentally is the fellow who's still the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Ayatollah Khamenei, it's not really Ayatollah, they had to fake it, they put him in, he wasn't really qualified according to Khomeini's ideas, but they did it. Khamenei had been somewhat liberal on domestic and foreign policy, but he knew that he really had no business being the supreme leader. So he turned extremely conservative, and that's the man we've had to deal with ever since. Now, the Iranians have a president, and the president, surprisingly elected, the president is not a real, the president is elected, sorta, when they're not cheating on the election, but the president runs the government, but he doesn't run the country. The Ayatollah runs the country, and there's been some problems between presidents and supreme leaders along the way. But a fellow named Khatami came in 1997, and the Clinton administration thought this is a new opportunity, but they were so frightened of dealing with Iran that in the 2 years from 1997 to 1999, until the conservatives basically Khatami remained, but he didn't have much power, he started to talk in very different terms, but we didn't know quite what to do with this information. So Clinton hoped to move the relationship forward, but ran out of time. In came the Bush administration. The Bush administration was interested in one country. Anybody know what that country was? What? Iraq. And they didn't know what to do about Iran. So instead of concentrating on Iran, which was the ultimate threat, as I might say Ariel Sharon told George W. Bush, but all this talk that Israelis were pro-Iraq, it's not true. Israel and the American Jewish community were as divided as anyone else. And I think you'd find, if you did real historical analysis and looked at the polls, that the Jewish community was not for the war. But outside of the war in Iraq, the Bush administration didn't know what to do. It didn't know what to do. It was heavily divided. And there were a couple of opportunities. When we invaded Afghanistan, the Iranians were on our side, pushing us on. They couldn't stand the regime of the time. They were completely on our side. The Clinton administration, I would submit, could have done more with it. The Bush administration, preoccupied with Iraq, not wanting to do about Iran, didn't do enough. In 2003, by May 2003, in what I would argue was the greatest mistake of the Bush administration, even greater than the attack on Iraq, and brought us to our current crisis, the Iranians set the word out around the world. Tell the Americans we want a deal, a grand bargain. We don't want a conflict. The nuclear system, which the Shah had started, the Ayatollah had sort of killed, and with the reformist Khatami had brought back, because he was an efficiency guy, so, oh, we've got this nuclear, well, we're going to do it efficiently. But it wasn't quite there yet in 2003. And the Iranians, it's pretty well known now, offered a deal. The Bush administration wasn't interested. This is a whole story unto itself. I don't have time. You only get through 7 or 8 topics if you don't deal with these details. But let me tell you that that was our moment to make a deal and stop the Iranian nuclear issue. Because in 2005, Ahmadinejad, the mayor of Tehran, was elected. He was a conservative. He was a bad guy for Jews, for Iranians, for the international arena. He was for Holocaust denial. He denied the Holocaust. He spoke against Israel. He spoke against the Jews. You could not deal with Ahmadinejad. And although the Bush administration made some compromises late in the administration, it had flubbed the Iran portfolio. In 2004, long before he was a household word, a young man running for the Senate in Illinois by the name of Barack Obama said to a reporter, "I'm against the Iraq war. The country we have to pay attention to is Iran. We need to make a deal with Iran and stop nuclear weapons." Over 10 years ago, that's what Barack Obama was saying. In May 2008, in the debate with Hillary Clinton, he made it very clear that he wanted a deal with Iran. As wild as that sounded, even with Ahmadinejad in power. Early in his presidency, in June of 2009, there was another election. Ahmadinejad, the bad guy, as far as I'm concerned, was running for re-election. And the election was so obviously rigged. Just take my word for it. I'm not going to go into it. Obviously, that led to a mini revolution. It's called the Green Revolution, but Obama didn't do anything about the revolution. Many asked him to join the revolutionaries, the young, the liberal, create a newer regime, a new Iran. I'm not sure he could have done it, but he didn't, because Obama wanted a deal with Iran, and he thought that 2009, that he could make a better deal with the regime itself. And in October 2009, he actually did reach a mini deal, which was not controversial, with Ahmadinejad. It lasted a few days, and then the supreme leader killed it. So now, it was 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. Ahmadinejad's been in power. There's not much progress. The Obama administration is cooperating with the Netanyahu administration on assassinations of nuclear scientists, on the Stuxnet, cyber, ruining computers, ruining centrifuges, and the like. But Obama is always looking for the possibility of deal. And in mid-2013, in comes our current president, Rouhani. And it turns out that even by 2011, the supreme leader had authorized secret talks in Oman between the United States and Iran. It goes back that long. So now he comes in mid-2013. There's a new deal. November 2013, there's a deal an interim deal that ends up being not so controversial by the beginning. And now here we are with the deal we have today. Now, I don't know how many of you have read the deal. One person. I find it very boring and uninteresting and hard to follow. I don't know if maybe you're a nuclear scientist. But let's talk about some of the highlights of the deal. and all the controversies about these highlights. It's not the best deal the United States has ever agreed to. Some of you are laughing because you think it's a horrible deal. And some of you are crying because you think it could have been better. And some of you just don't know what to think. So let me give you some thoughts. And I think there are good and bad elements of this deal. First of all, the notion that it ends basically in 10 to 15 years is very bad. 10 to 15 years is a long time. As I've just tried to show, with all the changing flows in the U.S.-Israeli relationship and in the U.S.-Iranian relationship. Time goes by. But to have it gradually end, and some aspects go on for 20 to 25 years, some aspects are permanent. There are all sorts of military features that the Iranians are supposed to keep if they do permanently. They're not supposed to have secret discussions with the Iranian, that the Iranian military is not supposed to do secret preparations. They're not supposed to have undeclared or secret procurement activities. They're not supposed to have secret nuclear material acquisition, and on and on and on. Those don't go away. But nobody's going to be there after 15 years to inspect. And that's a real problem. The real question, does Iran want to be Japan, which could have a nuclear capability anytime, but is not doing any of that? No one even sees it as a problem. Or do they want to be North Korea, which actually did violate a deal. I think it's more of a different circumstance than a lot of people think vis-a-vis Iran, but they did. So what does Iran want to be? And if anybody knows, please let me know. And I think at the heart of the problem is, which risk do you want to take? What's the card you want? You want to make a deal with Iran and risk its violating that deal? Or do you want to not make a deal with Iran and leave it unwatched? When it could get it, in present circumstances, could get a bomb 2 or 3 months, let's say 6 months. I don't know about you, but I don't think that's very, very long. What are you ready to risk? What's your card? Now, nobody's debated much the plutonium reactor, which is different, and I'm not going to get into all this in Iraq. I was very concerned about plutonium, frankly, because once you have a real plutonium reactor, you can't reverse it, as opposed to uranium. And that would be rebuilt under the deal. Then there's uranium. Well, uranium's more complex. Uranium's a lot more complex. And the United States did not get all it wanted with the development of advanced centrifuges. And when you read this, I at least was stunned by how much is going away and how much could come back. We're not really destroying the nuclear facilities, because the Iranians have always said they want for peaceful purposes. We're setting it back a long way, but we're not setting it back entirely. Now there's the whole question of inspections and monitoring. Now, inspections and monitoring have gotten a lot of controversy. So I'm going to spend 30 seconds more on inspecting and monitoring. Because if you can't inspect what the Iranians are doing, you don't know what's going on. And that's going to be the situation after 10 or 15 years. That's very worrisome. But when Senator Schumer describes the inspection regime, he starts by repeating the claim that inspections are not anywhere, anytime. That's wrong. There are 2 types of inspections that have been put. Remember the Obamacare kind of thing? It's a bit of Obamacare. Remember the death panels? Well, now it's the 24-day delay. Well, the 24-day delay is not accurate, but it comes into effect if the inspectors, whose numbers are going to be increased inside Iran, but if the inspectors are suspicious about that building over there down the block, and they think there might be something going on, they can cite that situation, and you have 24 days, and if it's only an incipient building, on the one hand, the Iranians have more time to turn it into a playground, but on the other hand, there are, as they did once, by the way, with the site that was suspected, but on the other hand, the West has a very good record, especially the United States, in discovering secret facilities in Iran. And also, there are residues, but you can also monitor. And in addition to the inspectors, we've, of course, got spies. We have a pretty good record. What's your risk? What do you want to take? But on facilities that exist where the inspector is suspicious, it starts with 2 hours, depending on the type of suspicion. Okay, we don't like this. We want to go into this particular situation. You've got 2 hours. And sometimes it's 24 hours, et cetera, et cetera. Very hard to cheat. And it's much more complicated than appears to be the situation. Now, the whole question of sanctions relief is also more complicated than it appears. I'm an academic, so we try to give you both sides. And the truth of the matter is, we don't really want any sanctions relief of Iran. Why should we give up on, and here President Bush, President Obama in particular, I think, have a lot of credit. And the real hero of sanctions, don't make a mistake about it, is a man by the name of Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu is in the mess he's in today, criticizing the deal because he pushed for sanctions. The sanctions were so effective that they scared Iran and encouraged the Iranian people to vote in Rouhani, and the result was that we have discussions and then a deal. And if you want to blame somebody or you want to praise somebody, one of the, I think it was today or yesterday, one of the foreign policy type of elite official journals proposed Netanyahu for, tongue-in-cheek in part, Netanyahu for the Peace Prize, because the Nobel Peace Prize, because he was the one who pushed everybody into doing the right thing. The trouble is he didn't like what transpired. I want to get back to this thing. You may start something you don't necessarily like in the end. But certainly that happened to Netanyahu. But the point is that the Iranians, we have a sanctions issue. Now, people don't realize that the United States has different kinds of sanctions on Iran. So, even if Iran does everything right, even if Iran, at least for the beginning, is a goody, and sanctions get, and they get relieved of sanctions, we have a whole range of sanctions that are non-nuclear, that are not affected by this deal. Because if we're sanctioning a group of terrorists in Iran, they're not affected by this. And there's some controversy now about the whole issue of economic sanctions, and particularly energy and financial industries may get relieved earlier rather than later if the Iranians play by the game, which I think certainly in the early years they will definitely do. Well, it's all mixed up and it's complicated, at least for American sanctions. The relief would be much delayed because there are all sorts of bank accounts that are confused and the like. And the snapback sanctions, I must snapback means sanctions renewed. I thought originally that sanctions would be very hard to resume. But since so much of it is the United States, and since a very important point that the pro-deal and the anti-deal people haven't been making. One of the amazing things about this debate is how poor the arguments are on both sides. But sanctions, sanctions are very complex. They're very complex, and it's not so easy to start up, to end sanctions, and it's not so as hard as was originally thought in starting up the sanctions again. Not so hard. It's harder than we thought to end, and easier then to restart, because a lot of companies, we're talking about all the greedy Europeans, Chinese, Russians trying to get into Iran to make money because their economies are bad. All true. All true. But if you depend on the United States, if you're, Russian company X, French company that Y, you got to think to yourself, if the Iranians don't play by the game and sanctions are renewed, then my company will be sanctioned for dealing with Iran. That's what's been declared. So maybe I'd like to make $1 billion, but maybe I'm going to wait a few months or maybe a few years, because I don't want to get sanctioned by the United States. I'll lose a lot more that way. You with me? You're not with me. I could see that. Okay. Let me introduce a billionaire. I'm happy that I just became a billionaire in the last 2 seconds. And I'm running my company out of Belgium. I don't like Belgium. So, all right, Belgium. So I'm the Belgian, I'm the Poirot of my industry. And my industry is silverware. Anyway. And I love this idea of Tehran. I can get a lot of money by promoting my silverware in Iran. Trouble is, if the Iranians start to abide, if the Americans think that the Iranians are abiding by the deal, so I can go in there, nobody's going to complain, all things right, and in 6 months, the Americans discover that the Iranians are cheating, then I'm going to get sanctioned by the United States. Even though I live in Belgium, I'm just trying to make $1 billion. But I'm going to get sanctioned because I'm dealing in Iran, because the Americans never guaranteed me that I'd be free if the Iranians violate the deal. So therefore, I think I won't deal with the Iranians. Thank you very much, guys. When you're ready to behave and everybody knows you're behaving and has seen that you're behaving, then I'll go into Iran. So it's much more complicated on the sanctions front and a little better from the perspective of pro-Israelis than it appears. Now, I could go on and on with this deal. I think I don't want to talk too long, so I will let that go. And let me go to my last section. I started talking about how worried I am about the American Jewish community, about the U.S.-Israeli relationship over this deal. So I've been looking for ways to enhance the situation, writing, working, talking all summer, because it's my field and I can't just watch it go. Now, some people are beginning to say what I've been saying, and I have a couple of articles I'm trying to get published, and it's harder and harder, but that's my problem. In the last day or so, Amos Yadlin, former chief of military intelligence, General Yadlin, he's now the head of of Tel Aviv University's Institute for Strategic Studies, INSS. He came out with a position which is a little different from his opposition to the deal. And I'm just going to try to summarize the points, and the question and answer can go a little further. But there is a whole group in Israel. There was a signature by a bunch of commanders. It's reported in Time Magazine and Joe Klein's piece in the last couple of days. There were a bunch, about 50 commanders, making the basic argument that Yadlin is making. And what's the argument? The argument is basically, we're stuck with the deal, let's make the most of it while we get stronger. So he's saying the deal is acceptable for its duration. It rolls back the nuclear program, introduces far improved inspection regime, and does so at least as effectively as a military strike would for the initial years. For the initial years. But he says it's unacceptable after 15 years. It legitimizes a comprehensive nuclear program, even though it forever prohibits nuclear weapons. Right. The proponents of the deal say, after all, they're going to develop nuclear power, but they're not going to, for peaceful purposes, they're not going to develop weapons. They're going to become too rich and fat to want to get into this business. So he says that the government of Israel, Yadlin, should drop the fight and accept the U.S. government's invitation to talk coordination and compensation. Get going on compensation for Israel. The Arabs are doing that. They're getting goodies. They don't like the deal. They say they don't like the deal, but they're taking the goodies from the United States. Israel is saying, we don't like the deal. We're not going to accept anything because then people might think that we weren't really against the deal. That's Netanyahu's position. I don't understand that position. I think it's time for coordination and compensation regarding, as Yadlin says, deal monitoring, deterrence, dealing with violations, coordination regarding Iran's subnuclear conduct in the region, which nobody's talking about. Money now, will there be more money for terrorists and the like? So Yadlin's saying, let's make a deal and let's go after the terrorists together. And actually, Obama is offering that in his own bizarre way, but he is offering it. Upgrading Israel's self-defense capabilities and anti-missile capabilities, intelligence, strategic arms, both ad hoc, that is Iran deal related, and covering the next 10-year U.S. assistance package. And of course, that's one of the worst things about the deal, which is that the arms embargo on Iran ends in 5 years, and the missile embargo, which is the most dangerous, ends in 8 years. Very, very big problem. So let me conclude with my proposal. And for this, President Obama mentioned President Kennedy. Everybody's mentioning President Kennedy. I, of course, want to mention President Kennedy. Over 50 years ago, America faced fears of a nuclear attack on our shores from the USSR in Cuba. And President Kennedy said the following. I was in graduate school. I remember as if it was yesterday. And the hush that went over the room, I was sitting in a graduate dorm. There's only one television for the dorm in those days. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. President Obama should offer a similar statement now, and that is adapted to the present situation. And to make clear to the Iranians that with or without the nuclear accord being ratified by Congress, the United States will consider an attack on Israel as an attack against the United States, and a full retaliatory response will follow, and Congress should endorse that statement, in my opinion. Israel's supporters believe that Israel is the country most threatened by an agreement with Iran. This is indeed a realistic assessment. And Israel's Prime Minister has correctly offered this argument as the reason for his taking dramatic and unusual steps to influence American policy. He spoke intensely on the congressional floor. I do not think that was such a good idea. He is now directly lobbying American Jews to pressure their representatives to vote against the accord. I don't think that's a very good idea either. It is not surprising, given Netanyahu's stance, that the president, I think a bit unwisely, but nevertheless, answered in kind, as in his speech on August 5th. I think he's responded unhelpfully that if Israel continues to oppose the deal, it will be further isolated and more vulnerable if the agreement is rejected. Again, like Netanyahu, I think that's an accurate assessment, but I think it's poorly taken. And I think the breach between U.S. and Israel, as I said at the outset, is extremely disturbing. Becoming bogged down in bitter arguments about whether Israel's defense needs are better served by Congress ratifying the accords or by Congress withholding support for them has only served to weaken U.S.-Israeli relations. There are better and more direct ways. So, like Yadlin, number one, many military and diplomatic analysts in both the United States and Israel are beginning to look at intensified aid to Israel to compensate the country for the possibility of increased dangers from the new billions available to the Islamic government in Tehran once sanctions end. We do not know whether, and I have already said that they won't get quite as much, not at all as much actually, as they think they're going to get, in my opinion. But whatever they're going to get, we don't know that they'll be shelling them out to Hezbollah and company, but we have to assume that that's what will happen and prepare accordingly. And so, many officials and non-officials in Israel and others in the United States, including in the Obama administration, are talking about more sophisticated weaponry to Israel, more intelligence cooperation, intensified anti-terrorism cooperation, and a host of other potential areas of cooperation that will contribute to enhancing Israel's deterrent capability. These are critical, and I think must be pursued. Number two, the president said in his interview with Fareed Zakaria on CNN a few days ago, last Sunday actually, before he went off to play golf, that all presidents play golf, I don't know what it is. But the point is that he said, well, of course, myself or any of my successors, if Israel were threatened, would do what we could to protect Israel in a time of need. That sounds very nice. It's not enough. It's reassurance to Americans and Israelis, to American Jews, not only American Jews, American supporters of Israel, and Israelis. It's not enough. What you need is a deterrent strategy to show the world, and especially Iran, that if Israel is threatened, then we will act. What we need is a statement to the effect, put in writing, endorsed by Congress, as I suggested earlier, that any WMD, weapons of mass destruction threat to Israel, will be treated as an attack against the territory of the United States. That's what President Kennedy said in the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's what we need, in my opinion, from President Obama now. Number two, the United States, not recently, but since World War II, has had a variety of bilateral treaties and multilateral treaties. There's the Rio Pact in Latin America of 1947 with the Latin Americans, to which President Kennedy referred in that speech. I recently reread it. There's the NATO treaty in Europe. And there are the bilateral treaties with such countries as Japan and Australia in Asia. It's time for Israel to be part of that family of closest allies. Americans, Jews, presidents, congressmen, politicians, rabbis have talked for decades about how important the U.S.-Israeli relationship is. No matter how tattered at the moment because of the disagreement between the two leaders, you can, I believe, make it clear to the Iranians where the United States stands if we had such a treaty, which would protect Israel not only from the Iranians, but from anyone else in the region who had any kind of nefarious schemes. The author of the idea for a U.S.-Israel Defense Pact was David Ben-Gurion. And many Israeli prime ministers have endorsed the idea ever since. But in discussing this idea with many Israeli friends who are part of the security community in Israel, they don't really think it's possible. They don't really think it's possible. So they love the idea, but they think it can't happen. Why not? If the American Jewish community stopped fighting about this deal and started fighting for a defense treaty whose moment has come, the chances are better than they have been ever in the history of Israel and the United States. I believe it could happen. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu is right. It might lead to a grudging acceptance of the current deal. I think Israel's better off with the grudging acceptance of the current deal and the defense treaty and the kind of statement that I've outlined that would be made in Congress than it is with the present situation. Okay, let's say Netanyahu defeats Obama. Netanyahu defeats Obama, the headline in all the newspapers of the country. The Congress has overridden the veto. Now what? Now what? Okay, we're going to get the Iranians to go back to the table. Why? We're going to get the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Russians to go back to the table. Want to bet? Now, they could play a game, they could go back to the table, pretend to be changing it, it wouldn't really be a change, the argument would start all over again. Who's going to protect Israel when this is over? If the deal is is defeated, sure, President Obama and company, Congress would push him. He would do it on his own, would have to aid Israel. But it wouldn't be like it would be now, when to many in Washington, Israel holds the answer to making this deal possible. And then, United States and Israel will not only have to work against the terrorists, against Hezbollah, against Hamas, against all these groups, but it would have to work to be prepared in 10 or 15 years. You don't sit around and wait and say, well, let's see what the Iranians do. Maybe they'll be nice guys. Maybe they'll be nice presidents. Maybe the Ayatollah will die, and they'll choose a liberal. That's not going to happen because they've packed the committee that chooses the next Ayatollah. And the way this Ayatollah is going in 10 or 15 years, will still be there anyway. But the point is, we do it together as a U.S.-Israeli alliance. The American Jewish community is united. That's a much better vision than the vision where we're heading and the vision where we are today. So having reviewed the U.S.-Israeli relationship, the U.S.-Iranian relationship, the Iranian threat, that's what I propose. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take a glass of water. I want to ask you a few questions. You ready? Mm-hmm. We'll have some fun. I never took your class because I wasn't at UCLA, but people who do don't get to ask questions like this. So it was for all of your graduate students, on behalf of all of them. A moment ago, you role-played very nicely a Belgian billionaire who's trying to sell silverware to Tehran. And you did a really wonderful job at that. So I'm going to ask you to role play a few people for us so that we can sort out the different opinions in this conversation. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Number one, in 2 minutes or less, if you were President Obama or Secretary Kerry, and you were trying to convince this audience that this deal is in the best interest of Israel and the best interest of the United States of America, what would you say?
Well, first of all, before my 2 minutes start.
Okay. That's exactly what they would say.
I wouldn't do the history bit, but I would argue that my plan is what they should be doing.
I'm going to get to your plan too, but I'm just interested in
ladies and gentlemen, it's very nice to be here out of Washington, away from Hawaii. But number one, this deal is not a perfect deal, but it's a deal that we and the Israeli people and the Jewish people can work with. Why? Because it gives us 10 to 15 years to work together, to prepare the technology, to work together as allies, to frighten and inform the Iranian people that there's a new life possible, and the Iranian government, to the extent it remains the same, that we can make things different. You know, to me, one of the most important motivations in working on this deal is to protect Israel. I deeply care about Israel. Throughout my political career and before, I have believed in Israel. Kerry could say, my brother is Jewish. My grandparents were my great-grandparents were Jewish. I believe in Israel. Look at Israel, the great achievements, the startup nation, a little country surrounded by turmoil that has become the living product that we should admire. Let's work together. Why are we at odds? Why are so many in the community trying to undermine this deal? I think we can work together towards a new future. This deal will become the beginning of that future in economics, in military and security, in health, in high technology. The American people and the Israeli people belong together. That's what's behind this deal. Love of Israel, not distrust. That's what he's not doing. That's what they're not doing. They're not talking the way I tried to talk in those 2 minutes.
Okay. Now I want you to switch, because that was good. That was really good. Now I want you to be Benjamin Netanyahu. You're the Prime Minister of Israel. And this is an American audience, and you need their support in 2 minutes or less. What would Netanyahu be saying to us tonight?
Ladies and gentlemen, you know that I grew up in America. I went to MIT. I got my start in America. I believe in America. And no country is closer to me than the United States. I am deeply upset. I find it a nightmarish experience to be in a position of opposing the President of the United States, of opposing so many of my close friends in the American Jewish community and in America in its entirety. I have always considered Israel the closest friend of the United States in the world. That's still true. What we are doing in our administration is out of love for the United States, not out of bitterness, not out of opposition. We are trying to save the United States from a terrible, terrible mistake. We are trying to save the United States from greater problems 10 or 15 years from now. We live in the Middle East. We have suffered the terror and the frightful policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We're closer to this than you are. We should not be seen as adversaries, but as friends. We should be seen as people who are trying to provide friendly advice. I'm so sorry that the President of the United States has chosen to see this as a challenge. I would prefer that he see this as close friends trying to move this process forward so that we together can end the Iranian threat. What we fear is that this policy will lead to a greater Iranian threat than we have today. Thank you.
Okay. Now for a moment, tell us, for a moment, I know this is going to be really hard. You're the Ayatollah. What's in it for him? Why has the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, allowed this deal to go forward when his breakout right now is if you take the deal as it's presented by the administration, the current breakout, that is the time it takes to have a nuclear weapon up and ready, is 3 months, and under the treaty we would extend that to a year or more. Why is the Ayatollah interested in this deal?
Do you want me to
the
portray
Ayatollah
the
for
Ayatollah speaking to his compatriots or to the Americans?
I don't know, what would you say? I don't know. Speak to his compatriots.
Yeah, that's a lot easier and a lot more realistic.
How's your Arabic? Or your Persian, I mean. You know.
Non-existent. Comrades. It is galling to me to have to deal with the Americans. They are so appalling and despicable in their secular immorality. It is appalling to me to have to make an agreement with these vicious and impossible tyrants. We will defeat them one day. I will not be here for that. But we must not sacrifice our own republic. And let us face the facts that the sanctions have destroyed our oil business, though we thank those who have cheated and worked with us. It has challenged our ability to gain support from our people who are suffering and who want a better life. And so we must make compromises, as bitter and galling as it was. The great Ayatollah Khomeini said it was like drinking hemlock, but he agreed to an end of the Iran-Iraq war, which we should have won and therefore lost. And look today, who is more powerful, Iran or Iraq? Who has a better future, Iran or Iraq? That's what the great Ayatollah Khomeini taught us. So we make this deal. And you see how the insipid Jews and the Israelis who do not have a right to exist, how they have reacted. They understand what is in it for us, because our entire nuclear program will be refurbished, diminished, but we will be able to have more nuclear electricity, more nuclear power, and it will lead to a stronger Iran. The sanctions will be removed. Our people will be happier. We will be more prosperous. We will be more influential. And our friends will gain as well. The great warriors of Hezbollah, those insipid Palestinians, the Hamas, who we applaud, but we don't like Hamas, but we will work with them in any case. We will establish a ring around Israel of terrorists. We call them heroes, freedom fighters. And we will make more allies because we will have the money. Those Sunnis who criticize us now, you see how the Saudis, those venom act. They will have to kowtow to us. We will gain in our own domestic power, in our position in the region. We will all advocate multilateral solutions to problems. We will work with the foolish Americans. We will work with the lowly Europeans. We will work with the upstart Chinese and the has-been Russians. We will call for multilateralism and cooperation. We will play to the Saudis and their outsized egos. But we will ultimately, over the decades, triumph because we have an opportunity to reframe ourselves to greater success. It really does gall me, and when I'm with the Ayatollah Khomeini, I will apologize. But it is our only way to move forward. Our economy has been destroyed. We must recoup.
You know, you do that really well. So as long as you're still in the head of the Ayatollah for a minute, let me come back to Steve. But I want to ask you this question, and it's been asked by numbers of members of the audience. The position that you're suggesting, Stephen, is that with a mutual defense treaty and with a very clear, explicit, and unequivocal statement that an attack on Israel will bring a full retaliatory attack from the United States of America. Is deterrence enough? Is the threat of nuclear retaliation or conventional retaliation, is the threat of American military force enough to deter Iran from destroying Israel? Or are the Iranians beyond that in a place of apocalyptic messianism, mysticism, irrational religious belief that the things that held back the USSR won't hold back the Ayatollah?
Yeah, this is a big line that's been carried about. I don't buy it. And in the era of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of people who did not think that the Soviets were so rational, who feared them tremendously. And I think that the ultimate proof that the Iranians are rational and determined is that they signed this deal. A lot of people would not have predicted they signed the deal. It's not much discussed. They did sign the deal. And I don't think they're rational. There's only one, I think there's once that, maybe twice, that any Iranian leader referred, they all talk about Israel has no right to exist, we're going to destroy Israel. I explained to you what Ehud Yari, the distinguished Ehud Yari, has said in the last couple of days in this article, American Interest, the current American Interest. It's a journal, you can get it on the web, I highly recommend it. First 3 articles free. I think that they are out to get Israel, some more than others, some are faking. But I do absolutely think that deterrence is enough based on their behavior over the last, since the beginning of the regime. They do not want to endanger the regime. If they think action A will lead, let's say an attack on Israel will lead to an endangerment to the regime, they will not do it based on all past Examples. Now, let's talk about what deterrence means. Just because I said that, I'm not ready to rely on that statement, but I want, in a deterrent alliance with Israel, you don't just say certain things. You've got to prove that you mean it. You've got to prove that you mean it by the actions you take, by the weapons you develop, by the kinds of relationships you that emerge. The President of the United States, even if he's only in for 16 more months or whatever it is, and the Prime Minister of Israel going at it as they are now, that's not good for deterrence. My point is that you can make all the statements you want, and that, since I agree with the question, you've got to be prepared. And there's no team better in the world than Americans and Israelis. Look at Stuxnet, look at the Iron Dome, et cetera, et cetera. When the Americans and Israelis get their act together and they're working together, there's no better team. And let me give one example. In the 1980s, I was a result of a group that was working and all that, but I became something of the front man. Lots of articles and commentary and elsewhere about the idea of the United States and Israel working together in a strategic relationship. And most of my colleagues, forget about UCLA, most of my colleagues around the country laughed at me. But it didn't take long before the Reagan administration was engaged in just what I and others were advocating. And so the strategic relationship between the United States and Israel, which has flowered so in the last 30s, was born. And it flowered. And it goes on to this very day, whatever Obama and Netanyahu's speeches may be going on. We can do more, we can do it better, and we can have more. And that's where you solve the problem, not in the rhetoric we see today.
All right, now let's take Ehud Yari's position. Ehud Yari is a journalist, very respected journalist and analyst in Israel, and as you indicated, he says that Iran's long-term plan is not to destroy Israel through nuclear war, but to destroy it through a very long war of attrition using the terrorists that surround Israel. Now, the treaty releases some billions of dollars to the Iranians. Some people say 50, some people say 150.
Right.
You know, pretty soon you're talking about some real money here, right? And let's suppose that some large proportion of that goes to the Revolutionary Guard.
Fully possible.
And the Revolutionary Guard then funnels that to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And Hezbollah, with $10, $20 billion, now refits the 35,000 rockets pointed to Israel with guidance systems. So instead of just dumb rockets that fall into the sea or into uninhabited areas, they're now mechanically targeted for Tel Aviv and Haifa and the other population centers of the State of Israel. What good does a defense treaty do at that moment?
Well, first of all, you develop ways of countering those rockets, and it's Iron Dome writ large. So you develop weaponry, which the United States and Israel have shown they're eminently capable of doing, to counter these kinds of missiles, and better yet, destroying them should the necessity arrive on the ground before they ever get far enough. And whatever else you want to say about the Gaza war last summer, and in which Israel was very reluctant to attack, and particularly the Prime Minister, who handled himself extremely well, I think, not because he was reluctant to attack, but because of the way in which the attack went. And I think that's part of the reason he won the election. But the point is, I want to intensify the cooperation which is already there. And I want the world to know Israel is a part of the family. It's not the cousin that we invite Yom Kippur for a meal. But the point is, after Yom Kippur, whatever, but it's, sort of afterthought. But the point is that there are a whole host of intensified relationships you get when you've got that kind of defense treaty. So I want the United States and Israel to work together, prepare for the onslaught. Now, it might be that Hezbollah gets $10, $20 billion. It might be that they get $100 million. Who knows what's going to happen? I would be very cautious about what they might get. And therefore, I want the strongest possible U.S.-Israeli relationship that we can have so that the Israeli scientists can go to work in conjunction with the American counterparts and turn the effectiveness of the Hezbollah rockets to what Hamas discovered, I say again, Iron Dome. You seem skeptical.
Let's turn to the other side of the argument for a moment. Michael Oren, among many others, has argued that were the deal rejected, that is, the veto upheld, that the United States could go back and renegotiate the treaty because the economic sanctions of the United States are robust enough to force the Iranians back to the table and to force the Europeans to respect that regime and to that effort to go back and renegotiate the deal. You dismiss that with a wave of your hand.
No, I don't dismiss it with a wave of my hand. I have thought a lot about it and taken it seriously. I respect Michael Oren greatly and know him well. I think the world of him. But I don't agree on this point. What that argument requires, and somebody made it from Prime Minister Netanyahu down, is that the Iranians would say, oh, you've rejected the accord, which we just hollowed out. Okay, let's go back and renegotiate it, and if we're renegotiating it, we don't come off as well. Well, number one, why should the Iranians do that? Would you? Unless they think the deal is so good that even if a little bit is chipped away, it's still worth it. But would the Iranians admit that? The culture is against that. It's highly unlikely, unless, and what I'm about to say is highly unlikely, the United States and Iran and the P5+1, the various countries involved in this, had a secret deal. All right, we'll pretend to change it, but we really won't change much, and it won't matter. Because how many times can you defeat this? That could happen, but the Iranians would have several other options. It's very unlikely. The United States, let's have the picture now. The United States Congress has overridden the president's veto and rejected the deal. So we're no longer part of it. But the Iranians have not violated the deal. The Iranians have accepted the deal. The Europeans have accepted the deal. The Chinese have accepted the deal. The Russians have accepted the deal. What would prevent everybody from going on? That's another scenario. And just the United States would be out of it. It wouldn't be the first time in history that the United States Congress, League of Nations, remember the League of Nations, said, okay, Americans, bye. You're going through one of your isolationist temper tantrums. We'll see you someday. Now, Israel isn't better off. The United States isn't better off. Let's take another scenario. The Iranians say, look, we agreed. We're 3-4 months away. We're going to admit it, that we're 3-4 months away. Well, we signed a deal to stop for the next 10 or 15 years. But you don't have the most powerful country on the other side aboard. So therefore, we're going to go for the nukes. I don't think actually they would do that, but they could. I think they'd much more be likely to try to break the sanctions with all the others and to therefore play along. But they might go the other way. I see very little good, and that's why I'm so mystified by the Netanyahu position. No one has explained to me, either privately or publicly, how you change the world as a result of the strong alliance between the Republican Party, which does control Congress, and the Prime Minister, the government of Israel, why anybody else is going to pay much attention. And Obama won't be worth much, presumably. Now, Obama has been very clever at pulling rabbits out of hats, but I don't, and he might try to get a deal, he might try to do something, but it's hard to believe that he could pull it off. I don't know anyone who thinks he can. So I think Israel is weaker if Congress votes against it. I really do. Because this may not be an ideal deal, but I don't know what we get. And if Netanyahu or anyone else in Israel or against the deal in America said, okay, if we turn down the deal, then we will get A, B, C, D, and E, and we will do F, G, H, I, and J, which will make us stronger. I'm ready to listen, but nobody's done that. Nobody's going to nuke them. Nobody's going to attack the nuclear installations because I think that day is now over. I think that alternative is over. I think when Netanyahu and Barak in Netanyahu's first term considered it, they didn't do it alone. So I don't see that happening. And besides, as Yadlin says, as General Yadlin says in Israel, and all the experts that I've talked to agree, that gets you 2 or 3 years. This at least gets you 10 to 15 years. And it gives you time to build up against the Iranians in case they go in a bad direction. And many people think they will, and I think that's, a good, you want to be prepared. Even if they turn out to be benign and they change governments and everything goes well. After all, George W. Bush believed in 2003 when he turned down the offers that they would have a new regime in 10 years. He's now 12 years. But maybe he will turn out to be right, just a little late. Great. We still have lost nothing, in my opinion. So I don't understand the other side. I've tried to figure out. I've talked to people. And I continue to talk to people, but nobody has an answer. When you say, okay, what will happen? You'll change the deal. I said, I don't think we can change the deal. Yes, you'll change the deal. I said, how? We know. They don't even say how we should change the deal. How are you going to get the Iranians to play ball? How are you going to get the Germans and the British and the French to play ball? Not to mention the Chinese and Russians. I don't see it. I could be wrong, and I'll be happy to be proven wrong.
Last question. I want to shift the focus away for a moment from the Middle East. This is also a remarkable moment in the political history of the American Jewish community, where the American Jewish community, which has been overwhelmingly democratic for the last 3 generations, is that fair? Is now...
Basically since FDR in early 1930.
Is now so, well, not only divided, but there seems to be such a powerful element within the community, a vocal element, so bitterly critical of a sitting Democratic president. Do you think that this moment in our history signals a realignment of the American Jewish community, and can we expect that to carry over into the presidential election?
I don't think so, actually. Let me explain. This has been developing since Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House in 1994, when the Republicans recaptured the House. And if you have to point a finger at when did this all start, that's the time. Now, people were saying for decades that the American Jewish community would be much more influential if it was really divided, so that each presidential candidate would not be confident. And indeed, since Richard Nixon, the Republican Party has wisely, I think, pursued the Jewish community as if that was indeed the case, even though American Jews tended to vote for the Republican candidate, for the Democratic candidate in the 70s. Varied from 72 to 77, pretty much, until the present day. So, I don't think there really is I don't think there's a transformation. I do believe, and this has also been coming for 20 years really, that the Republican Party, which used to be the party skeptical of Israel, began with, developed in the 90s, and the first culmination was H.W. Bush, and he's the only one who's been president in this era. The Republican Party changed its position. Instead of being more critical of Israel than the Democrats, it turned to being Israel can do no wrong. Now, I think that's a very highly positive development. The problem for the Republicans is on domestic policy. It doesn't have it. It doesn't have it for the Jews. I said to a friend of mine, tough Israeli academic, really tough guy, not on the left, let's put it that way, close friend of mine, spent a year in Washington. Everybody loved him. And he would spend a lot of time denouncing Obama, and we would have these sort of arguments, and I would say, you're going a little too far, and then he would go on. But anyway, we're very close friends, and we had a lot of fun. And I said, okay, his name is not Joe, but we're going to call him Joe. I said, Joe, let's pretend you're an American. I'm not an American citizen, I'm an American citizen, I'm an Israeli patriot. I know. I said, I know. But let's pretend for the moment that you are an American citizen, American Jew. And it's Obama versus Romney, or people like that. And Obama, the United States has declined because of him, the Arabs agree, blah, 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 blah. I said, okay. Let's say that Obama has all the weaknesses that you think he has. I'll give you all that. But you're voting as an American, and You're running against a candidate. Let's call him Jerry. Maybe Donald. At any rate, you're running against a candidate who is what he is on abortion, is what he is on gay rights. I gave you a whole list. I said, now tell me, put yourself in an American Jewish position. Who would you vote for? And he says, well, I don't know. Okay, the Democrat. So my point is, even a tough Israeli who can't stand Obama and who said to me, and this is crazy, he said to me just a couple days ago, he's back in Israel a while, and he said to me, I feel so bad for you, Steve. I said, why do you feel bad for me? You're a Democrat. I said, so? The Democrats are turning against Israel. I said, where's your evidence? I know that the Democrats are more critical of Netanyahu. That's true. He said, the future isn't with you, Steve. And I said to him, what's his name? Joe. I said, you are Israelis. You need Democrats and Republicans. I don't care what their positions are on domestic policy. I don't care where I stand as an American. But why would Israel purposefully alienate one of the two parties? I don't care if it's Democrat or Republican. If you care about Israel, you Israelis can't go after one of the parties. Don't go after the Republicans and don't go after my party. What's wrong with you? He didn't have an answer. But the point is, he says it's inevitable. I said, why is it inevitable? You're creating an inevitability. I still think that American Jews ultimately in the ballot box, and the polls back up my position, will vote with the Democrats. And think about some of the Republican candidates. I don't see how Hillary doesn't get the vote. So my point is that it's not the transition that we had in the 1932 election when the Jews who had been Republican already had developed in 1928 really moved to the Democratic Party, where they've been ever since. That doesn't mean that some prominent Jews and some non-prominent Jews haven't moved more enthusiastically to the Republican Party. It's certainly true. I don't think we're at a turning point yet. If a Donald Trump character, Donald Trump is a Democrat, Donald Trump character were running in the Democratic Party and the Republicans had a Jeb Bush type, that might not be the case. But so far, as long as the Republicans take the series of domestic policies that they take, I don't see a change in the American. I don't think this is a big turning point. I think it is a turning point. This is what I'm afraid of. This is what I began with in the American Jewish community and the ability of American Jews to live with each other in the unity of the American Jewish community. All of this I'm really worried about. But that's not you can have two Democrats. And one could be pro-deal and one could be anti-deal, and they still hate each other. That's the problem. The internal divisions in the Jewish community, not the other. Oh, listen, I have to fight BDS on campus. And I think at UCLA, we've had a lot of progress. It's not so clear, but you don't see those outrageous resolutions and the like. But all these issues, there's a lot of fights and a lot of problems. I'm worried that the community will be weaker as a result of this conflict. I really am.
Steve, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you.